And so, Dia, perhaps you can start us off. We heard from Jessica the many ways in which politics, rhetoric, discrimination, COVID together are impacting immigrants. In your experience, have you seen what are other additional considerations we must take into account?
Thanks, Denzel. And I just want to thank my fellow presenters today, who I think did just a remarkable job presenting both the legal challenges, the systemic the challenges, and then the therapeutic ones. So I don't think I have anything brilliant to add except to echo what they've already said and share my experiences of what it's been like at Cambridge Hospital in relation to these issues. So as many of you may know, Cambridge Hospital is the last remaining public hospital in the city of Boston, and we have a mission to serve the poor and the mentally ill. And so those populations, including immigrant populations, are overrepresented in our hospital. And everything that I think our experts have spoken to today are what we have been seeing in the context of the pandemic. The disproportionate impact of COVID, for all the reasons that Hannah mentioned earlier. For example, on our Haitian mental health team, as Hannah mentioned, our patients are overrepresented in poorly reimbursed and highly intensive healthcare settings such as PCA and CNAs. And we've had patients lose in multiple members of their family to COVID. There's a much higher burden of disease. And then when they do access care, as other people have mentioned, a lot of discrimination and inadequate care. So I think whatever pressures were already existing have certainly become intensified. On our Asian mental health team, we are seeing many more hate crimes and experiences of discrimination due to the Trump administration's rhetoric and of promoting COVID as the China virus. So in every aspect of our system, we're sort of seeing this collapsing effect and then I think, as Dr. Gomez mentioned, the crisis in mental health care and access, I do want to offer one interesting experience we're having at the hospital, which is that we moved quite quickly for a very aging system to telehealth, which amazed even me. And it's been a mixed experience because I think that we've seen more access available to certain immigrant patients. For, as people have mentioned today, people had to take off entire days to come to treatment. And now people can do it on the phone, they can do it on video. It's obviously not ideal. There are privacy concerns. And I have many patients with whom I do sessions in their cars or on walks. One of my patients was amusing me a lot by saying that she should get t-shirts made that says, "Don't worry, I'm talking to my therapist," so that if people see her on the street, they'll know that if she's crying, they'll know that she is talking to someone who's hopefully there to be helpful. So we are seeing a kind of mixed experience of access at our clinic. The other thing I will say, just to Dr. Gomez's point about self-care, one of the things that we really try to do at the hospital is what we call care for the caregivers. And because we're embedded in our community as a community hospital, we have been offering self-care and secondary trauma workshops to the people truly on the front lines of the pandemic. So medical interpreters are one example, who are we have a large proportion of them at the hospital and are really in the first person having to give news to families about deaths and other burdens of disease from COVID. And they're a highly traumatized group. And so that's one example. People who are school liaisons for undocumented children in Somerville, for example, they're another highly traumatized group. The 311 operators in the various cities around Cambridge and Somerville who get notification, anyone can call at any time. And what's really coming up in that workshop, and with this I'll pause and make room for the other speakers today, is a lot of survivor guilt among those of us who are immigrants, who are serving immigrants. So if we have status, we have any resources, what I'm hearing in the workshops over and over again is terrible survivor guilt, feeling that you can't put your phone down. A lot of our patients have struggled with burial costs for their family members. And so things like that, when those of us who are working with those patients feel kind of like we're not allowed to say no, we're not allowed to not respond to an email, we're not allowed to not respond to a crisis. And I think those groups and bringing a lot of people together to share that experience has been helpful.
Thank you, Dia. So let's dive in, and you painted such a vast picture for us. Let's dive into it. So what concrete advice attendees want things that they could implement today, tomorrow, going forward, things that they can adapt to. What would you tell them to do with immigrants who have experienced trauma? Describe a specific model or strategy, and how might these work with social distancing and remote? You talked about telehealth. Robert, you want to start us off?
First of all, thank you very much, Denzel. And I am so impressed with this body of speakers. I've taken so many notes here. I wish you could see my desk right now. So how wonderful to have this opportunity to go forward. If I could make a very brief comment supporting some of the statements made by Jessica, with respect to relationship building, obviously, we all know that's 101 counseling, 101 clinical work. But I have to say that my background is primarily as an asylum attorney. And so I've been doing this for about 18 years on a part-time basis, while I've been a professor of social work on a full-time basis. And so what I have learned in working with my clients, some of whom I first meet in jail, some of whom I first meet in a psychiatric hospital, and others I might meet in the community, I've learned that their levels of trauma are several. And it's very important for those of us in direct service and those of us who are more community activist minded to understand that there are multiple levels. And the very first, of course, is the fact that they have left their country, their homeland, because there was a crisis there. Very often they themselves might have been persecuted, or members of their family, or they have witnessed horrible things that have happened. So that's the first level. Then you have the level of the journey. What was that journey like? And sit down and try and really understand and allow your client to fully explore and talk to your client about that. I have to give you one little tip, and this is going to seem pretty frivolous, but I've seen it work magic. When I meet with my client, of course, I find out where the client is from. I bring a map of their country. And I say to them, where is your village? And boy, nothing has opened up, nothing has relaxed them more than to allow them, provide them time to talk about their homeland, to talk about their tribal or ethnic group and so forth. So as I say, that second level of trauma has to do with their journey. And I represent, in the last few years, more clients from Africa and from Central America. And many of you are very familiar from news accounts of what these journeys could be like. Then the next step is jail, detention for weeks, usually months, sometimes years, the next level of it, and talking to your clients about what that experience was like. And then finally, if they do get bond, if they are released from jail, they are now in a community. And whether it's watching or hearing a police siren go by, triggering memories for themselves, whether it's the survivor guilt, as was just mentioned, being concerned about their family back home, and here they are now safe in Massachusetts or in California or whatever. So I think it's very important for us to understand the complexities of these levels of trauma.
Jessica, he called it jail, and I think we need to sort of be very clear on what immigrants are experiencing. What do you have to add? What concrete strategies would you identify for attendees today? And then Dia, I'll go to you.
And of course, I'm going to speak a little bit more clinically because that's my background, that's where I live. And I would say, again, tailoring treatment, it's going to be different for everyone. And again, I think this area of trauma is really, it requires extensive training and experience. It's a specialty area of practice. Again, I'm going to emphasize, it's important to understand how these traumatic experiences, the journey when the person immigrated, what were the push-pull factors, what developmental stage did they happen, because that's going to give you a sense of how long the impact might be, what the intervention could look like. If there's one concrete recommendation I can give you, it's to look up Dr. Bruce Perry's work on the neurosequential model of therapeutics. And I know that's kind of heady, but it's just fascinating to see, depending on the developmental stage that it happened, it lets you know, gosh, if the trauma happened when baby was in utero and mom was traveling, then you're not going to sit there and try to talk to a child. You're going to maybe do a little bit more of that occupational therapy, movement therapy, maybe yoga, breathing. Whereas someone who was more verbal, that's going to kind of tell you the intervention. I would say also key thing, not only focus on helping the clients understand their trauma, but having the family understand so they can support. That's what I mean by that community care, and also stakeholders. Educating our teachers. I often pull in my teachers to say, you know, that behavior, that externalizing behavior you're seeing really is the child asking for safety or attachment. And I say, pay special attention to those internalizers, the quiet ones that seem to be doing well. So if we can kind of educate the stakeholders, I think we have a better outcome. Now, let me talk a little bit on the remote. Now, I would say that it's been a little bit more challenging for some of my clients in terms of accessibility, but especially in complex trauma, which I spend a lot of my time in. Out of my entire caseload, I would say about 25% are required to be in person with as much safety procedures as we can put in place. Also, for play therapists that I work with, and I work with some young children, remote is very challenging for us because it's about that relationship. And so, especially with that complex trauma. So this virtual world is working for a percentage of the population, and for another, it's not.
Dia, anything to add? We have a lot of questions to get to, by the way.
I want to just echo what Jessica and Robert have both said. And I guess what I would just add, and I want to speak in particular to the students and educators in the group, because I can imagine many of them are imagining, how can I, in my career, do, especially with the new Biden administration, do something to do, how can I be of service and of use? And I guess having done this for a long time, I guess I would say that what I see is everyone in our field, everyone wants simple answers to how do we help people with these overwhelming experiences of trauma. And so this explains the proliferation of these multiple methods of treatment. I see students and new professionals in the field, just literally tear themselves into pretzels trying to do an individual's work, which is really a societal level problem. So I would say that I think the proliferation of these so-called modules in the field are really an expression of our own insecurity as a profession and our unwillingness to look at what trauma really does to people. And so I would say that the issues really need to be addressed from the top. And as a very concrete example, I think that what we're seeing is a pressure on our field, including the law, to see more and more people for shorter amounts of time, even though we know that that really doesn't work. And so I think from an advocacy standpoint, we need to use what we know about the science of traumatic stress to argue for what treatments are really useful. Because when we were talking about cancer or COPD or ischemic heart disease, nobody is questioning what people need in those contexts. But just to echo what both Robert and Jessica have said, I think treatment begins with safety, both internal and external. So as much as we can help people with their lives, their relationships, as Jessica mentioned, but also their internal sense of fragmentation, I think that's where trust and safety begins. But I wouldn't want anyone, especially young people watching this, to feel that they have to master every technique and every module that's out there. Because again, I think that speaks to our desire to split trauma into manageable pieces because we can't really tolerate how overwhelming the experience is. I think beginning with safety and going by the principles we know and expecting it to be a long haul. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And I think that can help people adjust their expectations for what a career in this might look like.
I want to get to some vulnerable populations, and one of them is children. We have a lot of teachers actually in the webinar today, and I was wondering, with remote learning, and just for this one population, how can teachers identify students' needs when the teaching is being done remotely? We've heard a lot of stories about how revealing it is to be looking into the homes of their students. Jessica, any ideas?
Let me start by saying, in working in our school and with our educators, it's more difficult to detect some of the needs, especially mental health needs, virtually. Let's start there. And ideally, if I'm going to say, our curriculums, educational curriculums, would weave in social emotional health. At Momentous School, we teach children from pre-K 3 about their brains, about feelings, about breathing. And pre-K 3, walk by a classroom when they're doing yoga, right? And so it becomes normative speech for the kids to say, I'm having big feelings, or use Dr. Daniel Siegel's hand model of, I might not be able to say I'm overwhelmed, but I'm going to tell you my brain's up here. And so that's another person to look up if you don't know that, great language to utilize. My teenagers love it, or they give me this, this, this. So back to the teachers, again, it's really going to depend on developmental stages, these recommendations. But I would say start by normalizing talking about feelings at school. Do regular mental health check-ins, talk about therapy, and also normalizing that this is a really hard time for many of us. Schedule routine check-ins. I do that with my staff and my team routinely. Before we dive into the agenda, let me take a moment to be human with you and give you the opportunity. Also provide opportunities, our teachers, for conversations that can lead to the identification of problems, whether it's an art project, whether it's a theme that they're doing. And again, I reiterate, pay attention to the internalizers. Those are often the ones that go undetected. Our externalizing students are easier to detect, so pay attention to the quiet student.
If I may add, I've experienced a phenomenon that I think you're all very familiar with, and that is the child of the refugee, the child of the immigrant, becomes an adult quickly. In part because this child may capture the English language pretty quickly. And what becomes then is a child who takes on family responsibilities. I'll give you one small example. So one of the children who I'm really glad, and this was a person who was about 13 years of age, I had given her my card too and said, if something comes up, please give me a call. And she was very, she felt very good about that. So she gives me a call saying, my dad has to go to court because he was driving without a license. And he's been driving without a license for years, but finally he was pulled over by the police and now he has to go to court. And I'm very, very worried. And so it provided me an opportunity to say to her, thank you for calling. When her father learned out that she, on her own initiative, had called me, on the one hand, he was very proud, but on the other hand, he was quite, I don't know if the word is humbled by it. But I went to the court with the father because, as many of you know, ICE agents do corral our courts, and they do sometimes confront some of the immigrants in court, and they will try in some way to coerce them into a situation of incarceration. So my point is that the youngsters grow up pretty quickly.
We have a great question about another vulnerable community. Salemu asks, any ideas of reaching out to some particular refugee communities who may not know how to use technology or may not have access to technology?
Can I say something about that?
Yeah.
And this is more general, not just about technology. I don't have a client that I don't have an opportunity to hook that client up with other members from his country. Very often, the client will come here completely alone. And what a miracle it is for this person to then have a contact phone number or an email number of somebody from their home country, and particularly for Africans who may be quite isolated. And it's not hard for me to do this. And this provides me an opportunity to say to the clinicians who are out there listening to me, please expand your role as an educator and as a community activist. It will help you know your resources of who to call when you have a question, and it will also help you link up resources to your client as well. And so that's a little bit of advice in that line.
Ann from Boston asks, in the absence of mental health professionals or the availability of clinical interventions, what sort of community interventions did you recommend? And Robert, you were just talking about some sort of a level of activism.
There are so many, and we're very fortunate in the greater Boston area to have a plethora of agencies. And we need to be thinking of models, different kinds of models of integrating services. And so one model out of Cambridge is called DeNovo, D-E-N-O-V-O. And that's a model of bringing counselors and mental health people with lawyers in the same office. And so it one-stop shopping. So that's one example. The Boston Medical Center's Refugee and Health Program can really be a very useful resources. I'll give you another example of something that came up when we finally hit the enormous numbers of arrests under the Trump policies with ICE enforcement. A number of people, particularly in the faith-based communities, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities, came together, and they really pulled together a lot of resources to help bond people out, raise the money to do that. But at the same time, these folks, some of whom were professionals and others were not, they were learning the skills of being able to connect dots to help the family members of those who were incarcerated, and being able to help them in very practical ways and in very emotional ways. So I would just suggest that you as clinicians have a lot to offer to others in the communities, and you as teachers as well, to come together to really be creative about different kind of models and learn about the different models that are happening throughout the country.
Jessica, or Dia, anything to add?
I would just add that I think most of healing happens outside of the mental health field, sadly. Frankly, I think what gives me humility in our field is our entire knowledge of traumatic stress is about a tiny section of the human population that has managed to get themselves into mental health care. That alone is a miracle. So I think that, in fact, it makes us question, I think, what our data is based on in terms of representation. But I think the fact is most of it happens in communities. I would say another model that we've done at the hospital is to develop a system where people who are healthcare providers in their country of origin, so we have people who are, doctors in Syria and nurses in Egypt and various other parts of the world who, for reasons that I know you will all agree with, but I won't get into now, have not been able to get licensed to practice in the US, to become volunteer health advisors. And it has been an incredibly successful program. They go into communities, they do very non-threatening medical kind of checkups like blood pressure and education. It gives them a chance to use their incredible skills. And it's a way to meet the community and screen them to some degree. So if someone comes to them and says, oh yes, thanks for checking my blood pressure, but also I have a child who, it can be a way to get them first into primary care and then, if necessary, into mental health care. So I think using the resources that already exist in the community, which are so rich, and I think De Novo is another wonderful organization that Robert just mentioned. So I think it's just about us understanding that, most of the work that's being done is frankly a bit invisible to us as well.
Hannah, I'm going to ask you to join us for our last 10 minutes or so, so feel free to come on the screen. But let's step back a little bit, and we're talking about culturally informed practices. And we have several questions from people like Stephanie and Valeria, who want to know about spreading that message of mental health resources, of mental health help. How do you tell someone they need help without them feeling attacked? How do you break the stigmas in certain communities about mental health? And after that, what free resources can you point them to?
Well, I'll just say quickly that I have an easy way to enter into that discussion, because I would say to my client, one of the things we probably need to do in order to help you win asylum before the asylum officer or a judge is we need an affidavit. And it'd be really good to get an affidavit from a physician as well as from a mental health provider. So if you don't mind, I'm going to make you an appointment at blank, blank, blank. And so I have a way in to that conversation.
The only thing I would add is I would really encourage the field of mental health to really shift from this model of people coming to us, stepping over our threshold. And again, this theme of community, right? For us to get comfortable, to get out of our offices and the four walls and really get into the communities, being embedded in the communities, in the schools. And we need more mental health professionals in the schools, in the churches, in different community centers. Go where the people are and become part of that community. I think another factor is representation matters. I keep saying this again. When someone looks like you, when someone speaks the same language, when someone understands your culture, there's significant value of that. And someone might be more willing to open up and come to you based on that. It's not the only factor. And again, I think we've alluded to this a little bit, but we need to shift from taking an individualistic society, Western concept of health, and placing it on people. I think what we've learned is when we're in community, when we see community as part of nature, and where communities are built with these rich cultural enclaves, we're better for it. Diverse communities are healthier, financially more robust, if that's your bottom line. So I think if we were to utilize more of that, getting back to the basics, I think we'd be a healthier society.
Speaking again of vulnerable populations, Hannah, clarify for us. We saw articles earlier on in the pandemic of undocumented immigrants not wanting to see COVID testing or treatment. And perhaps if any of you have ideas about outreach, but Hannah, let's be clear, what can they do and what can't they do?
Yeah, so included in the COVID relief that Congress has already passed, testing for COVID is supposed to be available to all. I think the challenge, as you said it, is that, well, one is that we're going to need to make sure that as a vaccine is made available, that it's available also to everyone. But the challenge is also just in making sure that people feel safe accessing testing and treatment, regardless of whether they're legally allowed to. And so there's been increased funding for public health centers to make sure that there are places that immigrant communities may feel comfortable going. But I think, as you said to the other panelists, I mean, I think the education and outreach is going to be really, really key here to make sure that communities feel safe.
So I want to ask a sort of general question, and this applies to the immigrant and refugee clients, but also to US-born people as well. I mean, what steps can we take to give a sense of security and stability when most everything feels so uncertain and unstable? Dia, you want to start us off?
I think just on the note of what we've been talking about, I think in terms of developing both trust and demonstrating trustworthiness with our patients and our colleagues and I think both, I think creates opportunities for a sense of mastery in their lives, but also not to provide false hope around what is going on in our country. So I think what can really help is to demonstrate, I think Jessica had mentioned this, a really consistent presence with our students, with our patients, and a sense of accompanying them on the journey of what may be unfolding in our country, and a sense that there are other, whatever they may see in the rhetoric and the national discourse, there are other communities and other agencies with power that will assist them, while also I think being very realistic with them about their vulnerabilities. This came up recently in terms of whether we should be encouraging our patients to vote. And frankly, given what we are seeing in terms of voter intimidation and various things, we all decided that much as this would be a sign of advocacy, can also put patients at risk and disrupt the trust that we built with them under some sort of more paternalism idea on our parts to get everybody to vote. So I think those questions have to be really grounded in the reality of what our patients and students are going through.
The two sectors of society that I think are very important resources would be faith-based congregations and city halls. When you have a mayor, when you have a city council, when you have law enforcement officers who want to have particular events, cultural events and so forth, I think this can go a long way to making people feel that they are safe in their community, whether it's a small town in Kansas or whether it's a big city like New York or Boston.
Thank you for that. We have a lot of questions about, again, vulnerable populations and populations where there are serious language barriers or where there's illiteracy. Robert, you spoke earlier about connecting them to communities. Any other suggestions for these kinds of populations?
I think it just underscores the importance of you and I, those of us on the front lines as clinicians, as educators and so forth, of being able to be creative to develop programs across different agencies, across different institutions, so that vulnerable populations such as those who may be illiterate, and also an untapped resource, and I'm sorry to repeat this, but there are social groups for countries all around the world in every community, and whether it's in your particular town or the next town over. If you have a client who is from Uganda, who is from Bangladesh, there's a good chance that somewhere within a 100 or 200-mile radius, there'll be a group of people who meet, and they have dinners together, and they have celebrations of holidays together. This is an enormous natural helping resource for our immigrants and refugees.
And you're talking about this cross-sectional kind of approach. We do have a lot of people who want to know how to organize. What kind of allies should they bring into the picture? How do they convince their administrators? Hannah, what kind of coalitions can you talk about that would enact better policies in places where we don't have them right now?
I think one big piece that we found, and this was the reason for creating this national network, is that the immigration and refugee groups often sit at one table, and then we have a table that is discussing post-secondary education policy, maybe another table that's talking about children and family issues, a whole nother one on workforce, right? That happens across our policy areas and across issues, but it's particularly true that the needs of immigrants and refugees are not always brought up when we're having the actual conversations about particular areas that immigrant refugee families need support with, just like all the other families. So I think thinking about how to convene some of those tables together and thinking about what alliances look like, so that if you're trying to address whatever the particular need is, let's say it's childcare, then there need to be immigrant service providers, immigrant families at the table with the childcare advocates talking about childcare. And I think that's something that needs to happen at the local level, state level, and national level far more.
Yes, indeed. Immigrants are part of our communities. Immigrants and refugees are part of our economies. It's not a them over there. If you're talking about public safety, if you're talking about the health of your community, that includes those people. We really need to remember that. We are seeing refugees being settled, or up until recently, in places that traditionally did not have those populations. So I think it might be a very new idea for certain parts of the country, like let's say Nebraska or other places, but it's certainly a narrative that we need to push, right? I think a final couple of questions. Free resources, free mental health resources, free legal resources. Is there anything that you can point our attendees to? If you can't do it right now, we'll certainly like to compile something and send it to everyone after. But does anything come to mind, Jessica or Robert?
For immigrant refugee communities, in the faith-based community, the largest umbrella will be Catholic Charities and Lutheran Services, because these are the largest resettlement organizations in the United States of America. Secondly, so aside from those two groups, of which there are organizations in so many of the cities of America, the other would be your political government resources. Whether it's through their libraries or through other human rights commissions that they might have. So there are ways in which they have abundant resources to be able to help steer people.
I really like Robert's emphasis on some of the libraries and government. In Dallas, we were working on getting certified as a welcoming city. And so if you look at how can you become civically engaged with your city, City Hall has different appointees or positions sometimes focused on those communities. I would also say in the mental health world, NAMI, the Child Traumatic Stress Network, is a great resource for professionals and have resources for families as well in different languages. I posted our website, which has a blog that has a podcast, different topics. It's for teachers, for clients, people who are in therapy, and it's also for parents as well and community members. So lots of resources from different teachers and mental health providers as well.
Thank you so much for that. We got quite a lot of questions, and I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of them. We will provide information of places and resources that you can reach out to, including some of our speakers here tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. I would like each of you in just 10 seconds, you give us your top tip for taking care of ourselves. What do you think that would be? Jessica, you want to start us off?
Sure. I would say 10 seconds for us to normalize asking for help, setting healthy boundaries for ourselves, and making it okay as a professional, as a healthcare provider, to talk about being in therapy. And that's one of the things I like to emphasize with my staff of clinicians. It's okay to be in therapy. As a matter of fact, I worry more about people who don't.
Robert?
Nature, music, physical exercise. As my students would know from me, and many of them are listening in right now, swimming is probably the best thing. Cold ocean water can do wonders.
Not in the Northeast at this time of year. Hannah, it's not your area of expertise, but any ideas?
No, but I'm just going to add hope. And I think in particular in young people, I mean, I think what we've seen this summer, racial justice uprising led by youth of color, what we've seen with, for example, with the movement to have protections for dreamers being led by young undocumented people, that gives me hope for the future.